Here in Sydney with the #1 mechanical expert, Nick Mannell at the Nick Mannell Workshop. What a place. Nick, rebuilding hubs, it's a fairly important issue for the front of four-wheel drives. What can you tell us about the rebuilding process?
Basically, once you've got it stripped down, that's the easy part. You can start from there. Generally, we assemble the swivel housing first with an inner axle seal, new bearings, new seals, making sure everything is clean. From there, we move on to installing the CV after greasing and cleaning that, then onto the stub axle, backing plate and the associated parts there.
So Nick, how important is it in the way that you apply the grease to the CV before you put it back in?
That's very important. We need to ensure the grease is packed into the back of the CV. A lot of manufacturers only run a slight smear. What ends up happening there is the heat can't be dissipated through the grease. We apply grease liberally and make sure it is packed into the back of the CV as well, into the surrounding swivel housing and hub assembly.
So a good handful in around the CV, on the outside of the CV, around all of that area, but also up inside the knuckle as well?
Correct. It stops water ingress as well. If you do have a faulty seal, the grease will dispel the water.
And when you're in that far doing a rebuild, a lot of people forget to do the actual kingpin bearings, but that's quite a simple process, isn't it?
Quite a simple process, replacing the cones, the bearings, repacking both together and setting up the height so that the axle is running in the centre of the housing.
And that's basically just a case of putting back the shims that came off from the original?
Generally, no. It's good to inspect that height and make sure those heights are correct and that the preload is on that.
And Nick, what about the process of putting the seals back on the back of the knuckle? Because that's quite a confusing issue for a lot of people. There are quite a few different seals to go on there.
Yes, there is generally a steel retainer, a felt wiper, a rubber seal and another steel locator. And Toyotas and Nissans are also assembled different ways, so it can be quite confusing for people who don't understand the process.
Okay, so we've got the backing plate on, we've got the CV back on, the kingpin bearings back in place. Where do we go from there?
Obviously with that the stub axle went in, so from here we're ready to assemble the disc and the wheel bearings. Once they've been cleaned, packed with grease, they are then ready to assemble with new cones obviously when we're replacing them.
So Nick, where do we go once the rotor's on?
Once the wheel bearings are assembled with new bearing cones, we assemble the keyed thrust washer, followed by the first of the nuts which locates and sets your wheel bearing tension. Once your wheel bearing tension is set, we put on the lock tab, then the second nut, and then we key those over. These have to be keyed over either way, once for the rear lock nut and once for the front one to ensure that nothing comes undone. From there, the caliper can be assembled, and then we can look into putting the actual freewheeling hub or automatic locking hub on itself.
Now, Nick, I think it's probably important to tell people just why they need to clean that rotor very, very well.
Most of the cleaning solvents are used can leave an oily film on the disc itself. We use a specific brake clean to do that, so when you go out on the road on that first drive, your pad is not running in oil, which the pad obviously won't be able to dissipate the heat and apply that brake properly to the vehicle.
And Nick, how tight should you do up the nuts that hold those wheel bearings on?
The first nut is the one that actually sets the preload on the bearing. There is manufacturer specifications available for these, but all your good four-wheel drive mechanics out there will do it by feel. These need to be tight, but not so tight that they've locked the bearings or causing any issues there.
One thing I like about the four-wheel drive bearings in those front knuckles is they're taper roller bearings, so they can be adjusted from time to time when they do loosen up.
Correct, and that's again something that we check with every service we're doing on a vehicle. If you don't know the history on the bearing, I wouldn't advise just tightening it. You don't know if there's any grease in there at all or the condition of it or anything like that, and that's when you'll be advised to do a repack. Toyota and Nissan both recommend to repack them every 40,000 kilometres. Obviously, if you're running a larger than standard tyre, this may need to be done more often.
Nick, we've now covered a full rebuild. Thank you very much for your time and effort in explaining that to our viewers. What are the telltale signs that somebody needs to have their front end rebuilt though?
You can have oil leaks coming out of the backing plate or the back of the wheel, oil flicking on the outside or the inside of the wheel, shimmies, movements, noise. A bad brake pedal can be a loose wheel bearing. So get in and get it checked out if you're not sure.
So plenty of things can be done by the home mechanic, but realistically, if people aren't sure, if they need that expert advice, get down to an expert and get it looked at properly.
Certainly. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Nick, for your time.